I spent 50 years listening to people confess their deepest secrets, and I discovered something that still disturbs me. Most of you are living someone else's life without knowing it. You wake up every morning performing a script written by people who died decades ago: your grandfather's fear of poverty, your mother's unexpressed rage, your father's abandoned dreams. You call these feelings yours, but they're ghosts, borrowed emotions, inherited prisons. And here's what keeps me awake. You defend these prisons as if they're your identity. Today, I'm going to show you how to see the bars for the first time, and then, if you're brave enough, how to walk through them like they were never there. You're watching this because something inside you knows you're living at half capacity, maybe less. You've tried positive thinking, goal setting, cutting out toxic people, building better habits, and none of it sticks because all of that advice treats you like a machine that needs better programming. But you're not a machine. You're an archaeological site. Buried beneath your current personality are layers of selves you were forced to abandon. The angry child you had to suppress to stay safe. The wild self you traded for approval. The grief you never processed because no one gave you permission to fall apart. Every self-help strategy fails because it's building on top of unstable ground, on top of a foundation full of holes. You feel fraudulent in your own life. You've achieved things, but they feel hollow. You've been told to let go and move on, but you don't even know what you're holding on to. You're exhausted from performing a version of yourself that was designed to keep other people comfortable. And the worst part? You've been doing it for so long that you've forgotten it's a performance. You think this is who you are. Let me tell you what rebuilding yourself from zero actually means. It doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means excavating who you buried alive. The way forward is through the past, not around it. And the parts of you that you've labeled as damaged or too much or inappropriate are actually the raw materials for your reconstruction. Everything you've been taught to hide, to be ashamed of, to apologize for, that's where your real self is waiting. But here's the hard truth that no one else will tell you. Healing doesn't mean feeling better. Real transformation feels like treason. Treason against your family's unspoken rules, against the story you've told about yourself, against the people who needed you to stay small. I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to help you become real. And becoming real means you're going to have to feel everything you've spent your life avoiding. Think of yourself as an archaeological dig. Most people look at themselves and see a finished surface, maybe with some cracks they're trying to repair. But you're not a surface. You're layers upon layers of buried civilizations. Every version of yourself you had to abandon to survive is still down there, preserved in the unconscious like ancient cities under the earth. The you who was told your anger was unacceptable. The you who learned that your needs were too much. The you who discovered that being yourself meant being alone. These selves didn't disappear. They went underground. And they're still influencing everything you do, every choice you make, every person you're attracted to, every situation you find yourself stuck in. I want you to understand something fundamental. Your personality, the thing you call me, is initially just a collage of borrowed responses. You learn to laugh like your father, worry like your mother, apologize like your older sister. You absorb their gestures, their fears, their ways of moving through the world. This isn't a failure. This is how human beings develop. Children are like sponges, soaking up everything around them because they have to learn how to be human from other humans. But here's where it gets complicated. You didn't just absorb neutral behaviors, you absorbed their trauma too. Your mother's anxiety about money became your anxiety about money, even though you've never experienced the poverty she did. Your father's rage, which he swallowed down every day of his life, became the rage you swallowed down without knowing why. Your grandmother's grief over a child she lost became a sadness that lives in you like a ghost you can't name. We inherit emotional templates the same way we inherit eye color and bone structure. The difference is, No one tells you this is happening. No one says, by the way, that panic you feel isn't always yours. Sometimes you're just carrying someone else's unprocessed terror. Most people never graduate from echo to voice. They spend their entire lives performing a version of themselves that was designed in childhood, and they never stop to ask, who am I underneath all this borrowed material? Who would I be if I wasn't still trying to earn my father's approval, or avoid my mother's disappointment, or live out my siblings' unlived life? Here's the paradox that breaks most people. You had to become someone else to survive childhood. Children who are too much themselves get punished. If you were too loud, too sensitive, too angry, too joyful, too needy, too anything, you learned very quickly to adjust. You learned to become what was acceptable. And that adjustment, that mask you created, it saved you. It helped you get through childhood without being abandoned or destroyed. So, let me be clear. That false self you built was necessary. It was intelligent. It was your psyche's creative solution to an impossible situation. But now that borrowed self is the prison. The very adaptation that saved you is now suffocating you. You're walking around in a costume that doesn't fit anymore, but you can't take it off because you've forgotten you're wearing it. You think the costume is your skin. Let me continue, and we'll keep building this piece by piece until we reach the full depth you need. The child learns early that certain feelings are dangerous. Perhaps you cried once and were told, "Stop that crying or I'll give you something to cry about." The message was clear. Your sadness is unacceptable. Or maybe you expressed anger and were met with such overwhelming rage in return that you learned to swallow your fury like bitter medicine, letting it corrode you from the inside rather than risk the explosion outside. So you developed what I call reaction formations. You became excessively cheerful to hide your depression, overly agreeable to mask your resentment. The false self isn't just a costume, it's a fortress, and you've been living inside it so long that you've forgotten there's a prisoner within. I've sat across from patients who smile constantly, reflexively, even while describing the most horrific experiences of their lives. That smile isn't happiness, it's a scar. It's the face they learned to make to survive, and now it's frozen there. A permanent mask that prevents anyone, including themselves, from seeing the grief underneath. You understand, the false self is brilliant in its way. It's adaptive. It kept you safe when you were small and powerless. The problem is that you're not small anymore, but the false self hasn't noticed. It's still running the old program, still protecting you from dangers that no longer exist, while simultaneously preventing you from living the life you actually want. Let me give you another example from my practice. A woman came to me complaining of a mysterious paralysis in her hand. No physical cause could be found. Through our work together, we discovered that years earlier, she had wanted desperately to strike her abusive father, but couldn't. The thought was too forbidden, too dangerous. So her hand learned to be paralyzed instead. Better to lose the use of it entirely than to risk using it for that forbidden purpose. The false self operates on the same principle. You've paralyzed entire dimensions of your personality because expressing them once felt dangerous. Your authentic anger, your genuine needs, your real desires. They've been locked away so long that when you finally try to access them, you find nothing there. The pathway has atrophied. The connection has been severed. This is what I mean by repression. It's not that you're consciously hiding things from yourself. The process is far more insidious. The feelings, the memories, the desires, they get pushed down into the unconscious where they continue to live and breathe and exert their influence, but always indirectly, always through symptoms, never through direct expression. You develop anxieties that seem to come from nowhere, compulsions that make no logical sense. You find yourself repeatedly drawn to relationships that hurt you, jobs that drain you, patterns that diminish you, and you can't understand why. You tell yourself, this time will be different, but it never is, because the unconscious is running the show, and it's following a script written decades ago by a child who was just trying to survive. The false self becomes your representative to the world. It goes to work for you, enters relationships for you, makes decisions for you, all while your true self remains locked in the basement, banging on the pipes, trying desperately to get your attention through symptoms and dreams and those strange moments when you suddenly feel like your life belongs to someone else. You know what's particularly cruel about this arrangement? The false self is actually quite good at what it does. It gets promotions, it maintains friendships, it shows up to family dinners with the appropriate smile. It knows exactly what to say at funerals and weddings. It can hold a conversation about mortgages and school districts while your true self screams silently beneath the floorboards. And so you begin to believe that the false self times is times you. After all, it's the only version of yourself that seems to function in the world. The only version that other people respond to positively. Your parents praised this version. Your teachers rewarded it. Your romantic partners fell in love with it. How could it possibly be false? But here's what happens, and this is where my clinical practice became unbearably tragic. At times, the true self never stops trying to emerge. It cannot. It is the core of your being, your authentic vitality, and it will use every means at its disposal to get your attention. When you won't listen to its whispers, it begins to shout. When you ignore its shouts, it starts to sabotage. This is what we call acting out, though that term hardly captures the desperation of it. The businessman who inexplicably ruins his career just as he's about to make partner. The woman who picks a terrible fight with her loving spouse the night before their wedding. The student who fails the one exam that would have secured their future. We call these self-destructive behaviors, but that's not quite right. They are times false self**destructive behaviors. The true self is attempting a prison break, and if it has to burn down the entire structure of your life to escape, it will. I remember a patient, let's call him Heinrich, who came to me in a state of complete bewilderment. He had everything, he told me. A prestigious position as a lawyer, a beautiful home, respect in his community, and yet he found himself visiting brothels compulsively, risking everything he'd built. Why would I do this? He asked me, genuinely mystified by his own behavior. Why would I destroy my own life? But you see, it wasn't his life. It was his father's life, his father's dream, his father's version of success. The compulsive behavior wasn't destruction, it was communication. His true self was sending a message in the only language it had left. This is not who we are. This is not our life. Wake up. The symptoms always carry meaning. The inexplicable anxiety that strikes when you should be happy. The depression that descends just as you achieve what you thought you wanted. The physical ailments that no doctor can explain. These are not malfunctions. They are messages from the part of you that was left behind. The part that was too authentic, too vulnerable, 2 times real times to be allowed into your carefully constructed life. And here's what makes this particularly sophisticated as a defense mechanism. The false self creates what I call pseudo-satisfaction. You achieve the goal, and there's a moment, brief, fleeting, where you feel something. Your parents are proud. Your colleagues are impressed. Your social media lights up with admiration. But then, almost immediately, the emptiness returns. Deeper than before, actually, because now you've run out of excuses. You've gotten the promotion, the relationship, the recognition, all the things you told yourself would finally make you feel complete, and yet the void remains. This is when people often come to therapy, though they rarely understand why they're truly there. They present their life like a puzzle with one missing piece. I have everything I should want, So why do I feel like this? The answer, I must tell you, is both simple and unbearable. You have been living someone else's dream while calling it your own. Think about this carefully. When did you last sit with yourself, truly sit, without distraction, without the phone, without the noise, and ask what times you actually want, not what your parents wanted for you, not what society applauds, not what looks impressive on paper. What do you want? Most people cannot answer this question. They stumble, they deflect, they return to those external markers of success. Well, I want to be successful, they say. But what is success? I want to be happy. But what is happiness to you specifically? The questions hang in the air like smoke, and beneath them, a terrible realization begins to form. You have spent decades pursuing goals without ever stopping to examine whether they were truly yours. This is what I call the tyranny of the superego, that internalized voice of authority that tells you who you should be, how you should live, what you should desire. It speaks in the voice of your father, your mother, your teachers, your culture. It has been with you so long that you mistake it for your own thoughts. When you feel pride, it is often the superego saying, "Good, you have done what was expected." When you feel shame, it whispers, "You have failed to measure up." But here is what most people never realize. The superego does not care about your actual happiness. It cares only about conformity, about meeting standards, about maintaining the social order. You can satisfy every demand it makes and still feel utterly empty because you have been living as a performer in someone else's play. I see this with particular clarity in the realm of careers. A man comes to me, let's call him Thomas, a successful attorney. He has worked 70-hour weeks for 15 years. His father was an attorney. His grandfather was an attorney. Everyone told him he would make an excellent attorney. And he is excellent. By all objective measures. He wins his cases. He earns respect. He can afford a beautiful home. But he sits in my office and his hand shakes slightly when he speaks. "I feel like I'm suffocating," he tells me. "Every morning I wake up and I have to force myself to get out of bed. I used to think it was just stress, that I needed a vacation. But I've taken vacations, and the feeling is still there. It's like I'm living someone else's life, and he is. He is living his father's life, his grandfather's life. The law degree was never his desire, it was an inherited expectation, so deeply embedded that he never thought to question it. By the time he was old enough to recognize his own inclinations, he was already too far down the path, too invested in the identity of Thomas the attorney to imagine being anyone else. This is the trap. We build our lives brick by brick according to a blueprint we never consciously chose, and then we wonder why the structure feels like a prison, and the walls of that prison grow thicker with each passing year. Because once you have spent a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades living a particular life, the thought of dismantling it becomes terrifying. You have a mortgage now, a title, a reputation. People know you as a certain kind of person. You have introduced yourself the same way 1,000 times. I'm a banker, I'm an engineer, I'm a teacher. The identity becomes inseparable from the self. I call this phenomenon times psychic ossification, times the gradual hardening of the personality around external structures until flexibility becomes impossible. The young man who once dreamed of painting or traveling or building something with his hands now sits in meetings discussing quarterly projections, and he tells himself this is simply what maturity looks like. This is what responsibility demands. But responsibility to what? To whom? To the expectations he internalized before he even understood they were there. Let me give you another example, one I encountered in my practice. A woman came to me, 47 years old, successful by every conventional measure. She had climbed steadily through the ranks of her profession, accumulating accolades and authority. But she sat in my consulting room with tears streaming down her face, unable to articulate what was wrong. "I should be happy," she kept saying. "I have everything I thought I wanted." Notice the phrasing. Everything she times thought, times she wanted. Not everything she actually wanted, but everything the world told her to want. When we began to excavate her history, we discovered that she had made a crucial decision at age 19 to pursue a practical, stable career rather than the writing she loved. Her father, a man who had struggled financially his entire life, had impressed upon her the paramount importance of security. "Don't make my mistakes," he told her. And so she didn't. She made his choices instead. For nearly 3 decades, she lived a life designed to please a voice in her head that sounded like her father's, but had become her own. The superego, that internalized judge, had taken his values and made them her prison bars. And the most insidious part? She couldn't even see the bars. She only felt their constraint, a vague suffocation she couldn't name. This is what happens when we confuse compliance with authenticity. We perform the role so convincingly that we forget we're performing. We become method actors who can no longer step off the stage, and everyone applauds our performance, our parents, our colleagues, society at large, which only reinforces the delusion that this character we're playing is who we really are. But the psyche knows, the unconscious always knows. It sends us signals, symptoms, little rebellions. The successful executive develops mysterious headaches. The dutiful daughter experiences panic attacks before family gatherings. The man who followed all the rules wakes up at 3 a.m. with a crushing sense of meaninglessness he cannot explain. These are not random afflictions. They are the language of the imprisoned self, screaming through the only channels available to it. And what do we do with these symptoms? We suppress them, of course. We take pills to silence the headaches, anxiolytics to numb the panic, sleeping aids to quiet the 3 a.m. existential crisis. We pathologize the psyche's desperate attempts to communicate with us. We treat the fever instead of the infection, because examining the infection would require us to question everything, the entire architecture of the life we've built. This is why true self-knowledge is so rare, and why it requires such tremendous courage. To really look at your life and ask, whose dreams am I living? Whose fears govern my decisions? Whose voice speaks loudest in my head when I imagine doing something different? These questions threaten the very foundation of identity. And yet, and this is the cruelest irony, the people whose voices echo loudest in our heads, the people whose expectations we've internalized so deeply they feel like our own desires, these people are often long gone, dead, perhaps, or simply indifferent. Your father whose approval you still seek, he stopped thinking about your career choices years ago. Your mother whose disappointment you fear, she's worried about her own mortality, her own regrets, not your life path. We carry ghosts. We negotiate with phantoms. We sacrifice our present to appease specters who no longer even observe us. I spent my career excavating these voices. In session after session, I watched patients suddenly realize with a shock that physically moved through their bodies that they were living according to rules established by people who had no stake in their happiness. A woman in her 40s who realized she'd pursued medicine not because she loved it, but because her dead grandfather once said doctors were respectable. A man who'd avoided all creative pursuits because his father, now suffering dementia and unaware of his son's existence, had once called artists useless. The tragedy compounds when we recognize how arbitrary these internalized commands often are. A casual comment, a moment of anger, a throwaway judgment made by someone in their own pain, and we've built entire life structures around it. But here's what makes confronting this so particularly agonizing. To question these voices is to confront the possibility that we've wasted years, decades even, that we've been living someone else's life while our own authentic existence remained unexplored, like a foreign country we never visited despite holding a valid passport. This is why people resist therapy, resist self-examination, resist that voice inside that whispers you're not happy. Because happiness isn't even the question. The question is, what if I've been wrong about everything? What if the life I've built so carefully is built on foundations that were never mine to begin with? The mind has a brilliant defense against this realization. It's called rationalization. One of my favorite discoveries. We become experts at explaining why our choices were actually our own, why our limitations are actually preferences, why our fears are actually wisdom. I don't really want to travel. I'm a homebody by nature. Are you? Or were you never allowed to develop the confidence to navigate uncertainty? I'm not creative. Aren't you? Or did someone shame your early attempts until you learned to call your silence realism? I prefer stability to passion. Do you? Or did you simply learn that wanting things leads to disappointment, so you've redefined not wanting as preference? We become lawyers for the prosecution against our own desires. We build airtight cases for why we shouldn't want what we want, shouldn't feel what we feel, shouldn't become who we might become. And society, oh, how society rewards this self-prosecution. We call it maturity, responsibility. Growing up, we celebrate the person who gave up their dreams for practical concerns. We admire those who sacrificed their desires for family, for duty, for security. But scratch the surface of these celebrations and you find something uncomfortable. We're not really admiring the sacrifice. We're relieved by it. Because if you give up, if you stop trying, if you accept the prison of expectation, then we don't have to feel so uncomfortable about our own capitulation. Your unfulfilled dreams remind us of our own. Your courage to question threatens our careful rationalizations. Your freedom suggests our imprisonment. And so they attack not what you are, but what you represent, the terrifying possibility that life could be lived differently. I have spent my career listening to the confessions of the supposedly well-adjusted, and I tell you this, beneath their criticism of your choices lies an ocean of self-doubt. The married woman who scorns your relationship status whispers to herself at night, "Is this all there is?" The successful businessman who mocks your modest income stares at his bank statements and wonders if he sold his soul for numbers on a screen. The parent who judges your childlessness holds their crying infant at 3 a.m. and questions every decision that led to this moment. This is not to say their lives are without value or meaning, merely that they are human, and humans are doubt machines wrapped in certainty. We construct elaborate justifications for our choices, not because we are secure in them, but precisely because we are not. You trigger what I might call a defense cascade. Your existence alone forces others into a psychological position where they must either 1. Acknowledge that multiple valid paths through life exist, which would require them to accept responsibility for choosing theirs rather than being swept along by it. Or 2. Declare your path invalid, wrong, or inferior, thus protecting the uniqueness and correctness of their own. Most people, I'm afraid, choose option 2. It is easier. It requires no self-examination. It allows them to remain asleep while feeling righteous about it. But here is what makes this mechanism particularly insidious. They genuinely believe they are helping you. The critic who tells you you're wasting your potential truly thinks they're offering valuable guidance. The relative who expresses concern about your lifestyle actually feels they're being caring. The friend who suggests you're going through a phase sincerely believes they're providing perspective. This is projection at its most elegant. They reframe their own anxiety as concern for your welfare. They export their internal conflict. and deliver it to your doorstep wrapped in the paper of helpful advice. I once treated a patient, a professor of literature, who had spent 20 years in a marriage that had died long ago. When his younger colleague left her husband to pursue her research abroad, he was apoplectic. He wrote letters to the dean questioning her judgment. He spread rumors about her instability. He devoted tremendous energy to condemning her choice. In our sessions, the truth emerged like a monster from the depths. He was furious at her freedom because it illuminated his cowardice. Every day she lived authentically was a day that accused him of living inauthentically. Her happiness was a mirror showing his misery. Her courage revealed his fear. I should have left 10 years ago, he finally admitted, weeping. And now I'm too afraid to leave, too invested to stay, and too angry at myself to do anything but hate anyone brave enough to do what I couldn't. This, you see, is the true face behind judgment, not moral superiority, but moral anguish. Not confidence, but confusion, externalized. And what makes it even more tragic is this. The very people who judge you most harshly are often the ones who need your example most desperately. They are drowning and angry at you for swimming. They are lost and furious that you have found a path. They are imprisoned and enraged by your freedom. Your very existence asks them a question they cannot bear to answer. If they can live differently, why can't I? And rather than face that question, rather than sit with the discomfort it produces, rather than examine the cage they've built around themselves, they attack the question itself. They attack you. This is why your authenticity feels like aggression to them. You are not attacking their choices, but they experience your different choices as an attack. You are not judging their lives, but they experience your alternative life as judgment. Their reaction reveals their own internal conflict, not your shortcomings. They are arguing with themselves through you. They are prosecuting their own doubts by attacking your certainty. This is what I observed throughout my career. The people most disturbed by psychoanalysis were not those entirely comfortable with their repressions, but those already sensing the cracks in their defenses. The patient who insists most loudly that they have no unconscious conflicts is precisely the patient whose unconscious is most desperately trying to break through. Your family member who becomes most heated about your decision to leave the conventional path is often the one who themselves once dreamed of leaving. Your colleague who mocks your unconventional choices most viciously is frequently the one who secretly envies your courage. Their aggression is proportional to their internal conflict, and here is where it becomes truly painful. You cannot resolve their conflict for them. You cannot make them comfortable with your choices by explaining yourself better, by proving yourself more thoroughly, by demonstrating your happiness more convincingly. Their discomfort is not actually about you. It is about them, and only they can address it. This is perhaps the most difficult acceptance, that your growth necessarily disturbs those still sleeping, that your awakening serves as an alarm clock they did not request and do not want, that your liberation highlights their confinement in ways they are not ready to acknowledge. You will be tempted to dim your light so they feel less confronted by the darkness they have accepted. You will want to shrink your growth so they feel less ashamed of their stagnation. You will consider hiding your joy so they feel less bitter about their resignation. Resist this temptation with everything you have. Because when you diminish yourself to make others comfortable, you do not actually help them. You reinforce their defenses. You confirm their belief that growth is dangerous, that change is threatening, that authenticity must be suppressed for the sake of social cohesion. You become complicit in the very system of repression that wounded you both. The greatest gift you can offer those trapped in conformity is not to rejoin them in their cage, but to stand outside it, living proof that the door was never locked. Not to convince them with arguments, but to demonstrate through your existence that another way is possible. This does not mean performing your happiness for their benefit. It does not mean flaunting your growth or lecturing about your insights. It means simply, quietly, persistently being yourself, letting your life speak the truth that your words could never convey. Some will eventually understand. Some will, in their own time and their own way, find the courage to question their own choices. Your example will not convert them immediately, but it will plant seeds that may grow years later in moments you will never witness, and some will never understand. Some will remain hostile until the end, will interpret your every success as a reproach, will experience your every joy as an insult. This is not your failure. This is their tragedy. Their tragedy, yes, but not your responsibility. You cannot force the unconscious to yield its secrets before its time. You cannot compel another human being to confront what they have spent a lifetime constructing elaborate defenses to avoid. The analyst's couch can only work its magic on the willing. The same is true of every relationship. I learned this through bitter experience with patients who came to me not to be healed, but to prove me wrong. They would narrate their dreams, recount their symptoms, speak of their sufferings, all the while constructing an invisible fortress against interpretation. Every insight I offered would be met with yes, but, or perhaps however, or the most maddening of all phrases. I understand intellectually, but I don't feel it. These were not people seeking truth. They were people seeking vindication for their neuroses. They wanted me to confirm that yes, the world was against them, that they were uniquely damaged beyond repair, that their suffering entitled them to remain exactly as they were. When I would not provide this validation, I became another persecutor in their elaborate internal drama. With family members, this dynamic becomes even more complex because they know your history, your vulnerabilities, the precise location of every psychological wound. They have studied you since childhood. They know which buttons to push, which accusations will penetrate deepest, which silences will hurt most acutely. When you begin to heal, when you start to establish boundaries, when you refuse to play your assigned role in the family's unconscious theater, they will deploy this intimate knowledge against you. They will remind you of your failures, resurrect your past mistakes, weaponize your moments of weakness. Not because these things are relevant, but because they are effective. I remember a patient, a brilliant young man who had spent years in therapy working through his relationship with his mother, a woman who had consistently undermined his every achievement while simultaneously demanding his constant presence and attention. When he finally gathered the courage to limit their contact, to establish what we now might call healthy boundaries, she did not rage or weep. She became ill. Not theatrically ill, not dramatically ill, but genuinely, medically ill, with ailments that required his care, his visits, his sacrifice of the very boundaries he had worked so hard to establish. And when he hesitated, when he considered that perhaps this illness was psychosomatic, that perhaps unconscious processes were at work, she would produce medical documents, doctor's reports, proof that he was a terrible son for even suspecting such a thing. This is the exquisite cruelty of the unconscious mind. It will manifest physical symptoms to maintain psychological equilibrium. The body becomes the battlefield where unspoken emotional wars are fought. And the target of such symptoms, the child, the spouse, the sibling, is placed in an impossible position. To maintain boundaries appears heartless. To abandon them feels like suicide. What I told this young man then, I will tell you now. You cannot sacrifice yourself on the altar of another's unconscious conflicts. You cannot heal someone by allowing them to keep you sick. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is refuse to participate in the drama, even when the other person weaponizes their suffering against your refusal. This does not mean abandoning those who genuinely need help. It means recognizing the difference between someone struggling to heal and someone struggling to keep you from healing. The former will appreciate boundaries, even when they find them difficult. The latter will treat boundaries as betrayal. It's not about being cruel. It's not about withholding love or care. It's about recognizing that you cannot heal someone who is using their pain as a weapon, and your mother, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not, has been wielding her pain against you for years. When you were a child, you internalized this dynamic. You learned that her emotional state was more important than yours. You learned that your needs were secondary, tertiary, perhaps not even worth acknowledging. You learned to read her moods the way sailors read the sky, always watching for storms, always preparing for the next shift in pressure, and you became very, very good at it. But here is what no one tells you about becoming fluent in someone else's emotional language. You begin to forget your own. You become so attuned to their needs, their pain, their triggers, that you lose track of your own internal landscape. You stop asking yourself what you feel, because the question seems irrelevant compared to managing what she feels. This is how the cycle perpetuates itself, not through dramatic confrontations or obvious cruelty, but through the slow erosion of your sense of self. I have watched this pattern repeat across generations. The daughter who becomes the mother's emotional caretaker often grows up to seek relationships where she can replay this familiar role. She gravitates toward partners who need fixing, friends who require constant emotional labor, careers where she can sacrifice herself for others, because this is what feels like love to her. This is what she knows. Breaking this pattern requires something profoundly difficult. It requires you to feel selfish without actually being selfish. It requires you to prioritize your own well-being while your nervous system screams that you're abandoning someone who needs you. Your body will protest. You will feel physical discomfort when you don't respond to her text immediately. You will feel anxiety when you don't try to fix her mood. You will feel guilt so sharp it takes your breath away. This is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. This is evidence that you're doing something different. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between unfamiliar and dangerous. It simply registers change and sounds the alarm. Your work is to acknowledge the discomfort without letting it dictate your actions. To say to yourself, yes, this feels wrong because it's new. But feeling wrong doesn't mean it is wrong. I want you to consider something else, something that may seem tangential but is deeply relevant. Your mother's own mother likely did something similar to her. This pattern didn't originate with your mother. She inherited it, lived it, and now passes it along without conscious awareness that she's doing so. This doesn't excuse her behavior, but it does contextualize it. She is not a villain in a morality play. She is a wounded person who never learned that wounds require tending, not transferring. She never learned that pain needs processing, not perpetual validation. She never did the work you are doing now. And that is tragic. I feel genuine compassion for the person she might have been if someone had helped her develop the tools she needed. But my compassion for her past does not obligate you to sacrifice your future. You can hold both truths simultaneously, that she suffered and that her suffering does not justify the patterns she's recreated with you. This is the essential maturity that many people never achieve. They remain trapped in either-or thinking. Either she's entirely bad, or I must tolerate everything. Either I cut her off completely, or I continue exactly as we've always been. But reality offers more nuance than this. You can love someone and still refuse to participate in dynamics that harm you. You can honor their pain while declining to absorb it. You can wish them well while maintaining careful distance. The hardest boundary, I have found, is the one you set with someone who has never been taught that boundaries are acts of love rather than rejection. In my years of clinical work, I have witnessed countless individuals who were raised in families where boundaries were either non-existent or weaponized, where privacy was violation, where saying no was betrayal. where the only acceptable response was complete enmeshment or total abandonment. These individuals grow into adults who experience every boundary as a door slamming in their face. When you set a limit with such a person, they do not hear, "I need to take care of myself." They hear, "You're being cast out into the cold." The boundary becomes, in their internal theater, a reenactment of every abandonment they have ever feared. This is where your work becomes excruciating, because you must hold the boundary times, and times manage your own emotional response to their pain. You must remember that their distress does not negate your need. You must resist the ancient pull to collapse your selfhood in order to soothe theirs. Let me be clear, their hurt is real, their fear of abandonment is genuine, but their inability to tolerate your separateness cannot become your emergency. You are not responsible for repairing wounds you did not create. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep another person warm. And you are not cruel for recognizing that some people, through no fault of your own, cannot meet you in a relationship of mutual respect. This is the paradox we must sit with. The person who needs boundaries most is often the person least equipped to receive them without experiencing them as violence. What do we do with this impossible situation? We proceed with compassion times and times clarity. We acknowledge their pain times and times maintain our position. We offer what we can offer times without times sacrificing what we cannot afford to give. In practice, this might mean saying, "I understand you're upset that I can't talk every day. I care about you, and I'm not abandoning you. This is what I can offer. 2 conversations a week. If that doesn't work for you, I understand, but I can't negotiate beyond what I know I can sustain." Notice what this language does. It does not defend. It does not justify. It does not explain your worthiness to have needs. It simply states a reality and holds it gently but firmly in place. The person on the receiving end may rage. They may weep. They may accuse you of not loving them enough, and you must find a way to witness their pain without absorbing their interpretation of your actions. This is advanced emotional work. It requires you to tolerate being misunderstood. It requires you to allow someone else to be wrong about you without correcting the record, without pleading your case, without contorting yourself to prove your goodness. I have seen people exhaust themselves in this writing long letters explaining their intentions, offering evidence of their care, trying desperately to make the other person see times that the boundary is not punishment. But here is what I learned again and again in that Vienna consulting room. You cannot reason someone out of a wound. You cannot logic them into feeling safe when their nervous system is screaming abandonment. Your responsibility is not to make them understand. Your responsibility is to be truthful, to be kind when possible, and to hold your ground even when kindness is received as cruelty. Some people will never forgive you for having limits. They will cast you as the villain in their story, and there is nothing you can do to change the narrative they need to tell themselves. This is grief. This is loss, and it must be mourned. You may need to grieve the relationship you hope to have with this person, the one where your needs were respected, where your boundaries were honored, where you could be separate and still connected. You may need to accept that love, real as it is not always enough to bridge certain divides. That grieving process, I must tell you, is not linear. You will cycle through denial. Perhaps if I just explain it better, they will understand. You will feel anger. Why must I always be the one to bend? You will bargain. Maybe if I set just this one boundary differently. And eventually, if you allow yourself the full experience of this loss, you will arrive at acceptance. But acceptance does not mean resignation. It does not mean you failed. It means you have integrated a painful truth. that you cannot control another person's capacity for respecting your autonomy, no matter how clearly you communicate, no matter how reasonably you present your case. I have watched people torture themselves with the belief that there exists some perfect combination of words that will finally make the resistant party understand. They revise their explanations, they gather evidence, they enlist allies to plead their case, and all the while, they are avoiding the central realization: the person in question understands perfectly well. They simply disagree that you have the right to set this boundary. This is where we must distinguish between someone who struggles with your boundary because it triggers their own wounds, which is workable, given their willingness to examine those wounds, and someone who fundamentally rejects your right to have separate needs. The former is a relationship challenge. The latter is a statement of incompatibility. You will know the difference by observing patterns over time. Does the person show genuine effort to manage their reactions, even if they stumble? Do they take responsibility for their feelings, rather than making those feelings your obligation to manage? Can they hold the tension of their discomfort without demanding you dissolve the boundary that causes it? Or do they escalate? Do they employ increasingly sophisticated methods to make you responsible for their emotional state? Do they frame every conversation about your needs as an attack on their character? I must speak now about the particular pain of setting boundaries with family members who raised you. Here, the resistance is often fortified by decades of established patterns and the powerful narrative that you owe them unconditional access to you because of the care they provided in your childhood. But let me be direct. Care given in one phase of life does not purchase unlimited rights in perpetuity. Parents who genuinely love their adult children want them to develop into autonomous beings with separate lives, even when that separation causes the parent some sadness or adjustment. They recognize that healthy attachment includes differentiation. When a parent responds to your adult boundaries with accusations of betrayal, with reminders of their sacrifices, with emotional withdrawal designed to punish you back into compliance, they are not relating to you as you are. They are relating to an image of who they need you to be in order to maintain their own psychological equilibrium. And you, I understand, may feel a profound guilt in recognizing this. You may think, but they did sacrifice. They did provide for me. Who am I to now withhold from them? Here is what I wish you to understand. Acknowledging their care and maintaining your boundaries are not mutually exclusive acts. You can be grateful for what was given while also requiring that current interactions respect who you have become. Gratitude does not mean you must remain the child who had no choice but to accept the terms offered. You are now an adult with the right and responsibility to define the terms under which you engage. This may mean limiting contact. It may mean ending certain rituals or traditions that require you to suppress yourself. It may mean that the relationship becomes smaller, more formal, less intimate than either of you wished. These outcomes are legitimately painful. They represent losses that deserve to be mourned. But consider what you preserve by maintaining these boundaries: your integrity, your self-respect, your capacity to be authentic in other relationships that do not demand your self-abandonment as the price of connection. The paradox that troubles so many is this: if I set boundaries, I might lose them. But if I don't set boundaries, I lose myself. Yet this framing presents a false equivalence. Losing someone who can only remain in your life if you continuously betray yourself is not the same category of loss as abandoning your own identity, your own psychological integrity, your own right to exist as a separate person with legitimate needs. Consider what you actually lose when you sacrifice boundaries to maintain a relationship. You lose authenticity, the capacity to show up as yourself rather than as a carefully constructed performance designed to manage someone else's emotional state. You lose reciprocity, the experience of being cared for as genuinely as you care for others. You lose peace, that internal coherence that comes from alignment between your values and your actions. You lose respect, both for yourself and, paradoxically, often from the very people whose approval you sought through your self-abandonment. What remains after such losses? A relationship, yes, but one built on a foundation of pretense. A connection, perhaps, but one that connects only to the version of you that you present for consumption, not to the complex human being you actually are. This is not intimacy. This is performance art with an audience of one, and you are both the performer exhausted by the constant show and the stagehand, invisibly managing all the technical aspects that make the illusion possible. I return here to a clinical observation. Those who maintain the healthiest long-term relationships are not those who never set boundaries, but those who set them consistently and early. They communicate their limits clearly before resentment builds to critical levels. They say no to small impositions before they accumulate into massive, relationship-ending confrontations. They practice what I might call preventive boundary maintenance, the ongoing work of clarification and negotiation that keeps relationships reality-based rather than fantasy-based. The people who truly love you, and here I speak of genuine love, not the possessive attachment that masquerades under that name, will adjust to your boundaries. They may initially feel surprised or even hurt, particularly if you have trained them through years of boundarylessness to expect unlimited access and accommodation. But if the relationship contains real affection and respect, there will be adaptation, there will be recalibration. The relationship will find a new equilibrium that includes space for your autonomous existence. Those who cannot make this adjustment, who respond to your boundaries with escalating punishment, manipulation, or abandonment, thereby reveal something essential. They were never interested in a relationship with you as a complete person. They wanted a function, not a human being. They wanted a support system, an emotional dumping ground, a validation machine, a tool for their own needs. When the tool asserts its humanity, their rage or withdrawal exposes the transactional nature of what you had mistaken for connection. This revelation, though painful, is ultimately clarifying. It saves you from the perpetual confusion of wondering why you feel so depleted by relationships that appear, from the outside, to be functioning. It explains that persistent sense that something is profoundly wrong even when you cannot identify any single dramatic violation. What is wrong is that you have been cast in a role that requires your self-erasure, and you have been performing that role so convincingly that even you sometimes forget it is a performance. The narcissist trains you to accept a reality in which your perceptions are constantly negotiable. They teach you that what you saw did not happen, that what you felt was irrational, that what you remember is a distortion. And gradually, imperceptibly, you begin to internalize this uncertainty. You stop trusting the evidence of your own experience. You develop a reflexive doubt about your own judgment. Before voicing an observation, you pause and question whether you are being too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic. This hesitation becomes automatic, a psychological stutter that precedes every attempt at self-assertion. Consider how this manifests in the simplest interactions. They arrive 2 hours late without explanation. Your initial response is irritation, which is entirely reasonable. But before you can express this, they respond with wounded confusion. "I thought you'd be happy to see me at all. I've been dealing with so much stress, and this is how you greet me?" Suddenly you are explaining, apologizing, trying to demonstrate that you are indeed happy to see them despite your unreasonable focus on punctuality. The conversation that should have been about respect for your time becomes instead about your failure to sufficiently appreciate their presence. This inversion happens so smoothly that you may not even notice the substitution. Over hundreds of such interactions, you develop a kind of learned incompetence at recognizing your own legitimate needs. You become fluent in the language of self-doubt. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this isn't actually a problem. Maybe I'm expecting too much. These phrases become mantras, automatic responses to any internal signal of distress. The narcissist does not need to actively gaslight you in every moment, because you have internalized the gaslighting mechanism itself. You perform it upon yourself, reliably and thoroughly. This is why the aftermath of such relationships often involves a period of profound disorientation. When you finally extract yourself, you discover that you have lost touch with basic psychological skills that once seemed natural. You must relearn how to interpret your own emotional responses. You must practice trusting your own perceptions without immediately subjecting them to recursive doubt. This is not weakness or damage beyond repair. It is the predictable result of extended exposure to an environment where accuracy of perception was consistently punished and self-doubt was consistently rewarded. What remains difficult for many to accept is that the narcissist is not necessarily aware of the architecture of control they have constructed. They are not sitting in a dark room plotting psychological manipulations. They are simply doing what comes naturally to them, what feels necessary for their psychological survival. Their need for constant validation, their intolerance of criticism, their requirement that others function as extensions of their will, these are not conscious strategies but automatic patterns forged in their own developmental history and now perpetuated without reflection. This does not absolve them of responsibility. It simply clarifies the nature of what you are dealing with. You are not in relationship with someone who could choose differently if only they understood the harm they cause. You are in relationship with someone for whom these patterns are ego-syntonic, meaning they experience them not as problems to be solved, but as natural expressions of how relationships should function. When you explain how their behavior affects you, they do not think, "I should change this." They think, "You should accept this." The implications of this reality extend far beyond the immediate interactions you experience daily. This is not merely about tolerating unpleasant behavior or accepting character flaws. This touches the very foundation of what makes genuine intimacy possible, the capacity for mutual influence, for being changed by the experience of another person's inner world. When you share your pain with someone capable of empathy, something remarkable occurs. They take in your experience, hold it within their own psychic structure, feel the weight of it, and are moved to respond in ways that honor your vulnerability. This exchange is the essence of emotional connection. But narcissistic individuals experience such exchanges fundamentally differently. Your pain does not penetrate, it deflects. Your vulnerability does not inspire tenderness. It registers as expectation, demand, or even threat. I have observed that those in relationship with such individuals often develop what I might describe as chronic emotional vigilance, a constant monitoring of the other's state, an exhausting attunement to subtle shifts in mood that might signal oncoming criticism or withdrawal. You learn to read vague expressions, to detect dangerous undercurrents in innocuous statements, to prepare defensive responses to attacks that have not yet materialized. This hypervigilance is not paranoia. It is adaptation to an environment where emotional safety is genuinely unpredictable. What strikes me most profoundly is how this dynamic colonizes your capacity for spontaneity. You cannot simply speak your mind, share a disappointment, or express a need without first conducting an elaborate internal calculation. Asterisk. Will this threaten them? Will this trigger defensiveness? How can I phrase this so it doesn't become about their reaction rather than my experience? Asterisk. Over time, this calculation becomes so automatic you may not even recognize you are doing it. Your natural expressiveness becomes constricted, filtered through the narrow aperture of what will be tolerated. The person you become in such a relationship is not the person you were before it, nor the person you are with others. You are performing a highly specialized role: stabilizer, admirer, need meter, threat absorber, and the performance is so demanding that it leaves little energy for authentic self-expression. You may find yourself thinking, asterisk, I used to be more confident, more playful, more certain of my perceptions. Asterisk. This is not coincidence. The relationship structure itself requires your diminishment. And here we arrive at perhaps the most painful recognition. Your love, your patience, your understanding, these do not heal narcissistic wounds. They do not gradually teach the person that intimacy is safe, that vulnerability can be met with care rather than exploitation. The fantasy that your consistent devotion will eventually convince them of their worthiness, allowing defensive structures to soften, is tragically misguided. You are not failing because you haven't loved enough or been patient enough. You are attempting something that violates the basic principles of how character structure develops and maintains itself. The defenses that constitute narcissistic personality organization were constructed in early childhood as solutions to overwhelming experiences of inadequacy, shame, or emotional abandonment. They have been reinforced through decades of lived experience. They are not simply habits to be unlearned through corrective emotional experiences. They are the very architecture of the self. To ask them to relinquish these defenses through the power of your love alone is to fundamentally misunderstand the depth and function of characterological adaptation. This does not mean people cannot change, but meaningful characterological change requires something your love cannot provide: the individual's own recognition that their current way of being creates suffering times for themselves, asterisk, combined with sustained, skilled, therapeutic work aimed specifically at these patterns. Without internal motivation and professional support, your devotion functions primarily as enablement. It makes the continuation of dysfunctional patterns more comfortable, not less necessary.